another way to think about it, let's say Jan is playing the piano and you're listening to it, and you say, that is a really happy piece of music. And Jan says, no, it's not a happy piece of music, it's a sad piece of music. What if the person who composed it says, you're both wrong? It's not happy, it's not sad, it's angry music. Is the composer right? Is the performer right? Or are you right?
I think I should think that I am right. Because that makes me more comfortable.
Okay. And what we talked about last week, one part of narrative fidelity is we pick the story that's the world we want to live in. What if you're the person playing the piano and you thought, okay, this is a really sad piece, and you learn and you practice and you want to make it as sad as you possibly can, and someone listening to it says, oh, it sounds happy. What would you then think?
That makes me frustrated.
Maybe. Yeah. One of the things we know about stories is that you can live a story, you can tell a story, or you can recognize a story. Telling a story, you could be telling a real story that really happened, or you can just make up a story. Living a story, there are some days where everything's just routine, the day is just normal, and you know you're not going to remember the day. But then some things happen to you that are so important or so unusual that you know you're going to tell them someday. And actually, here's a good moment. Have you, I know I'm putting you on the spot that I did not warn you in advance, but have you ever had anything happen in your life that you wound up telling people the story later on?
Yes, I have.
Ooh. Would you be okay telling me about it?
For example, when I was little, I traveled to Hawaii with my family, but I got lost and I was alone in a big palace.
Wow.
And American Japanese people came up to me and they talked to me in English, but they look like Japanese, and I didn't know they can speak Japanese.
I love it.
I was confused, and later I tell that story to my friends.
Right. You were confused. What happened? How did they find your parents? Did they reunite you with your family?
And later I ran away from the Japanese Americans. I found my dad was lying under the tree.
Oh, perfect. That's good. That's good. Okay. I will come back to that because we're going to talk about the parts of the story. And when you first told it to me, there were a couple of parts missing, and then you added in the last parts, and it became a complete story. So that's a really good example. Have you ever... Okay, let me give you an example of what I mean by recognizing a story. Sometimes a police officer might be investigating a crime and might talk to 3 or 4 different witnesses, and little by little the police officer starts to see what happened. So the police officer's not telling the story. Other people are talking to the police officer, but they put it together and it becomes a story. Reporters do that. Reporters will go out and they'll talk to people, they'll find physical evidence, and then they eventually tell the story. Have you ever recognized a story going on in somebody else's life that wasn't happening to you, but you just recognized it?
So, the story that didn't happen to me,
right.
but I recognized. The example. So the story that my friend told me.
Well, sometimes someone will just tell us a story. A friend of yours might say, oh, let me tell you what happened to me. But what I'm talking about, like, have you ever had your friend will talk about something that's bothering her, and maybe she tells you what's bothering her time after time after time, and you start to say, okay, I know what's going on. You're making a mistake that's repeating itself. Here's what you're doing every time, and you just recognize the story, even though she wasn't trying to tell you one. Did that ever happen to you?
Yes. A friend of mine had a boyfriend that bothers her.
Oh, wow.
She talks about him again and again.
Right. Keep going.
And
That's good.
I thought that she interprets what the boyfriend's doing badly.
Right.
So the story that she's telling is not true. It's only part of the truth.
Right. That's good. That's good. I was not even thinking about how that happens when people talk about their romantic or dating relationships. And I study dating relationships for a living, and I didn't think about that. That's a very good call. Parents often do that with their children. Parents will notice things coming up in their children's lives and say, this is what is happening to my child. Bosses do it sometimes with their employees. Coaches do it with their athletes. Does your fencing club have a coach, or do you just kind of teach each other? Okay. Have you, at any point, watched one of the other members in the club and seen this is the mistake they're making over and over again, and they couldn't see it?
Yes. Each student, each senpai, is teaching different things.
Wow. So recognizing a story when it's happening to somebody else, but you have enough distance to see it, one of the first things that we say about defining a story is, where is it? And the where is it, you could be in the middle of it. It could be your own story. Like, we'll do this just for the exercise. What was your first day here at Tokyo University of Foreign Studies? Do you remember what your first day was like?
Yes, it was a ceremony, and I was wearing a suit. And many kind of students from many majors. Right. And I was surprised that the Spanish major is kind of big. It was cold.
Sure.
And I made 2 friends. And there was a long line to take photos in front of the Topps monument.
Right. We do this sometimes. In the field of communication, we have a thing that we study called a memorable message. And on days like your first day in college, they'll have ceremonies to try to make a memorable message or a memorable experience, so that little event in your personal story sticks with you and is positive and you feel welcome and all of that. That's part of you being in a story. It's big moments in your life. If you ever get married, your wedding will be a big part. Your graduation will be a big part of a story that you're in. Now, we've mentioned already, you can make up stories, fictional stories. When you do research, you may tell the story of something you read about. And then someone else can have a story and they don't even notice it, but you notice it. And you might tell it to them, or you might tell it to other people. So all of that gets at the question, where is story? You don't want to think that stories are necessarily in only one place. Like some people think stories are just things that people tell. But stories are also things that people live inside, and stories are things that people notice even when they're not telling them. Okay. Second issue. What is a story? What is a story? Okay. Have you ever listened to a really small child, maybe 3 years old, tell you what they did with their day?
Yes.
What's it sound like?
It sounds like the order is not right.
Right. Oh, good.
And it's only his or her the point.
Right.
And sometimes it's not right.
Right. I mean, The first thing is that because they're young, there are a lot of things they don't understand. They make a lot of mistakes. But the important thing, for our purpose, small children, they'll just list things that happened. And they'll list them out of order. And they'll say, then we went and played, then I went to the bathroom, then we had a snack, just one thing after another. And people who study story for a living, they say, as you are growing up from a baby up to typically about an 11-year-old, somewhere around 2 or 3, you hit the spot where you can list events one after another, but you don't point out what relationship they have to one another. Kids get to be about maybe 11 years old, and by then, it's not that they're all good storytellers, but they know how to explain that one event affected another event. So then, I was playing my video game, and I lost track of time, and then we were late for school, so my mom really had to hurry. And the events start influencing each other. And that's a big part that some people say is the first essential part of a story, that it's events in order where you explain that one event affected another event. There's this old example, the king left, the queen died, and that's not a story. The king left, the queen died of a broken heart. That's a story, because the first event caused the second event. Okay. The basic elements of a story, and the story you told about your trip to Hawaii fit this very neatly. There are 3 of them that go together naturally, and then the 4th one we've kind of been talking about already. There's the setting. So your story happened in Hawaii, and it was on a family trip, and those are 2 important elements of setting. Where in the world? Who were you with? And then you were in a palace, and that refines the setting even more. Second element, characters. You have to know something about the people involved in the story, because we tend to respond to stories, to like them or not, based on whether we identify with the characters. So you can tell a story about what happened to you when you were small. And I like the fact it was Japanese people, but they spoke English. And why do you think that's a good detail in that story?
Why that is a good detail?
Yeah, a detail that makes the story more interesting, or that a good story for you to tell.
Because you can identify the characters.
Sure.
More.
Yeah. They're vivid. They're easier for your listeners to see when they're imagining it.
And it has a contradiction.
Yes. There's something surprising about it, especially because you're a small child. They look familiar, you expect them to speak Japanese, and then they speak English. Yeah, and that throws people. So we mentioned setting and characters. The third part, the most important part, people who deal with stories say, if this is not there, there is no story. Conflict. And the simple definition of conflict, someone in the story, they are being denied something they need. There's something they need and they're not getting it. So in your story, you're a little kid, you're in Hawaii with your family, you're in a palace. So far, is there a story just from those 3 statements?
It's not a story.
Right, because there's no conflict. Nobody is being denied something they need. But then all of a sudden, you're lost. Now there's a conflict, because you're being denied being with your parents. You're a small child, by yourself, far from home. That's the conflict. That's what draws people in. Oh, how is this kid going to get back to her family? Okay, so setting, characters, and conflict are the basic parts of the story. We're going to talk in a minute about psychology, about some of the research out of cognitive psychology. The one quick thing I'll give you, the experiment has been run several times. And if you tell someone a story and you leave out one of the basic parts of the story, afterward they'll have a very hard time remembering it. But if you include all the basic parts of the story, people tend to be able to repeat it from memory. They almost learn the whole story as a unit. And when you first told the story of your experience in Hawaii, You got about halfway into it, and you said, I got separated from my parents, and then there were these Japanese people who spoke English, and I was very confused, and you just stopped. And do you remember how you ended it?
I was confused.
Right. But then you told more of the story. How did the story end?
And I found my dad.
Right. You ran away from them. It was confusing, so you ran from them, and then your dad was laying under a tree, and you found him. Now, if I heard all of that in one telling, that's going to be easy for me to remember. There's a setting, there's characters, there's a conflict, and then you overcome the conflict and you get what you need and the conflict is resolved. But if you just tell it as, I was in Hawaii with my parents, we were in a palace, I got separated from my parents, I ran into these Japanese people who spoke English and I was confused, and you stop there, experimentally it's been demonstrated people won't remember that. We talked last week about narrative coherence. It doesn't hang together. It's not a complete story. So one thing to say is when it's got all the parts, it has more of an impact on people. Okay, let me see. That brings us to, let me see if I have missed anything. Oh, yeah, there was something important that I wanted to do. One of the things, and believe it or not, after I went fishing around for my markers last week, this week, oh no, this is going to kill me if I didn't bring them. There they are. This week I did bring them. One of the things we do with stories is we recognize there are different kinds of stories. And I'm going to put about 3 on the board, but I want to see if how much of the board we can actually fill. There is such a thing as a funny story. There are such things as romantic stories. So 2 people meet, they do all sorts of goofy, shy things, they fall in love, they live happily ever after. There is such a thing as a mystery story. Something's happened, it's hard to understand. You tell the story of how the mystery is solved, and it's all very clever. And I'll put one more up here. Scary. We can find scary stories entertaining. Sometimes we tell them, sometimes we make movies out of them. Sometimes scary stories are good for teaching. You tell the story of how someone was unwise or did something dangerous, and people learn from it and they don't do that. What other kinds of stories can you think of that are just kinds that you hear and you recognize? There's funny, there's romantic, mystery, scary. Are there any other kinds of stories? Any other? There's different kinds of music. There's dance music. And you know what those different kinds of music are. There's also kinds of stories.
So, the examples?
Sure. Well, categories.
Sad stories.
Sad. Good sad stories. Heartwarming, yes. Heartwarming. My mother is approaching 90 years old. She'll be 90 on her next birthday. And I have found people her age really like heartwarming stories. They find the world at this point kind of scary. And when someone tells them a heartwarming story, they really appreciate it. That's a good one. What else? This is one where I wish we had a room full of people because we could get everybody in on this. Hungry stories. Or hungry or angry? Oh, angry. I'm sorry. I thought you said hungry. The masks do not help. Angry. I am going to combine that with frustrating stories. Can you think of story types that are not just emotions? Because we're kind of falling into that. Sad, angry. That's kind of an emotion.
A story that explains
Very good. Teaching stories. Or, there's a better word for it than that, because we've already said those can be teaching stories. This is kind of loose, but I'm going to say documentary. Because nature documentaries often tell the story of this is what this particular life form does when it reproduces. Or there are fables, there are stories that parents tell the kids to teach them good manners. Those are teaching stories. Those aren't really documentaries. Can you think of any others? Ooh, good. Yes, rumors. Rumors and gossip. There's an entire academic field and academic major that has the word story in its name, but there are a couple of other letters in front of it.
Article? Class? Teaching? No.
Well, that would be kind of what we've already said, teaching story. But if I wanted to talk about what happened in the Meiji Restoration in 1878, or if I wanted to talk about the Edo period, what am I talking about?
History.
Yeah. Historical stories. When you teach history, you're always telling a story. And I will add as a subset of that, very commonly, war stories. Exactly. War stories tend to be part of history. And these are stories that are not necessarily about emotions. Can you think from literature of particular kinds of stories that are popular, that sell a lot of books? We've named a few already, but go ahead.
It's a Japanese literature. It's a funny story.
Family story. Family or funny?
Funny.
Funny stories. Cool. So a particular kind of funny story.
The movie Pretty Woman is a romantic story.
Ooh, yeah. Good. A romantic story.
And I want to add one more.
Go for it.
The one kind is advertising.
Advertising. Ooh, I love it. Advertising story. Very often, advertising agencies who are coming up with a new advertising campaign for a product, they'll ask the people who make the product, what story is your product telling? Where do you want customers to imagine themselves when they think about buying your product? If it's maybe they're selling a snack, and the story is you get together with all your friends, and this snack is what all of you enjoy together. And that's a story. Very good example. Okay. The entire point of that. In biology, there's a thing they do where they take all of life, all different forms of life, and they put them together into kingdoms. So there's the animal kingdom and the plant kingdom. And then there are species. So there are dogs and there are wolves, and those are different species. And the thing about stories, there are broad categories. There are specific ones. We tend to recognize them. We tend to know this is a good place to tell a funny story. This is a good get-together to tell a scary story. They have their recognizable variants. And in the weeks ahead, as we get to different uses of story, we're going to talk about, I wouldn't say there's a list of types of story that everybody agrees on, but I think if I went out in the foyer here, most people going to school here would know what it means for something to be a romantic story. Just when you live and you're around other people, you recognize most of these and what they're useful for. All right. So now, let's see. Let us get, just for a couple of minutes, into some things that come out of the field of psychology. First thing. Let me get a different color marker. Are you familiar with this term, which is sort of English? It's really a Greek word, but it's used a lot by cognitive psychologists. Is that a familiar word, schema? Okay. Let's see. So this is a pen. Is this a pen? Is this a pen?
How do you call it?
Well, it's a marker, but right. I have in the United States on my desk, I have this, I wish I had a picture of it. I have this toy. It's a rocket, and there's a red button. Children always love this thing because they want to push the red button, and when they do, the rocket flies up off the pad, and then I catch it, and I show them it's a pen. But it doesn't look like a pen. But you have in your mind the schema of pen, and lots of different things can be pen, and they look different from one another, but you've got that category in your mind. That's what a schema is. Well, some schemas, or the plural is schemata, some schemata, they're about what happens, how people behave in a certain situation. And then that particular schema, the word for it is a script. Because actors in a play or actors making a movie, the script tells them how to participate in the play or the movie. So, if you were to go to your favorite restaurant, what is your favorite restaurant, by the way, or just a restaurant you like? If you went there right now, what would happen in order on a typical visit?
I will order chicken rice.
Okay.
And sticks of chicken.
When you first came in the door, would you just sit wherever you wanted, or would they show you where to sit?
I will say hello to the customer.
Perfect.
And she will indicate the table.
Right.
And I sit.
Mm-hmm.
And I look at the menu.
Right.
And I order.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and I eat. And I pay.
And she'll bring you out your food, right? And that happens. That's part of the script. Is it one of the restaurants where there's a buzzer to ring, or do you have to say sumimasen, or? Okay, so you get her attention if you need anything by speaking up. That's all part of the script. So a visit to a restaurant is a script. A script is a schema, and there are so many things where we know how to behave because we've been there before and we know the script. You may have had friends where you've been a guest at their house, you've been invited over and met their family, and their family has a way of doing things. And maybe the first time you visit, it's all very strange. But then you get used to what they do, and then you know the script. And one of the things to know about stories is not only do we tell them to remember what happened, not only do we tell them for teaching or anything else, just to know how to behave. We have all these little stories. Because what happens when you go to a restaurant is in itself a little story. And in developmental psychology, often the way researchers will think about small children growing up and becoming participating members of the culture is they have to learn all the scripts. So that then brings us, real quick, one of the basic things about storytelling and about narrative. I think I can get rid of our list of different... Oh, it's over here. No, here it is. My eraser. I can get rid of our list of kinds of stories real quick. Or at least part of it. There are, broadly, in cognitive psychology, 3 kinds of knowledge, or 3 kinds of knowing. Category, series, And this is going to be familiar because I've already written it right up there. Schematic. Category, series, schematic. Knowing things by category. Let's see. How many different kinds of fencing sword are there?
3.
Okay. There's a foil. There's a saber.
Yes, saber.
Ferrule. So ferrule. F-E-R-R-U-L-E. And then epee. Epee I know about, and saber I know about. Okay, but there's 3 of them. And you could tell, I would expect at a glance, what kind of sword it was. Or at least if you got a good look at the sword, you would know that's a saber, that's an epee.
Yes, I guess.
Perfect. So that's categorical knowledge. You know by looking at a sword which category it belongs in. Second way of knowing series is knowing something. Some things go before, some things go after. So if you know the letters of the English alphabet and you know that A comes before Z, then you know the series. You know them in order. If you know historical events and you know that the Meiji Restoration happened before Emperor Showa was crowned, then you know you have serial knowledge. The third one, the schematic, the thing about that, you know how pieces fit together, not only what category they go to, not only what order they belong in, but you know how they all add up to something bigger. So let's say you are a doctor, and you're examining someone and they have a problem with their kidneys. If you're a good doctor, you know about how all the organ systems in the body add up to a person being healthy. You know not just the individual parts, but what does the whole look like? And so cognitive psychologists say the reason that stories are not categorical, that they're not even series, they would be series when a 3-year-old just lists the things that happen and there's no cause and effect between them. What's missing is their story is just a series, it's not a schematic. But when you tell a story, you know the whole thing and you know what it adds up to and you know what it means. And what we talked about briefly at the past 2 class meetings, people will take what they observe around them and they'll turn it into a story because they get confused and they don't know what events that are happening, they don't know what they mean, but if they can tell a story, suddenly they do know what it means. There are people who say that the coronavirus pandemic was made up. It was a conspiracy by drug companies to make a lot of money and by governments to take over and make everybody obey. And there are people who believe that because if that's not what happened, then this is all so bizarre and confusing and you don't know what's going to happen next. But people who believe the conspiracy, they know what's going to happen next. The drug company is going to make more money. They're going to cook up another version of coronavirus so we all get locked in our homes again. They're evil. They're the bad guys. We're on the good side. We're the good guys. This is all very meaningful. So, something to know about what it takes to make something into a story is there tends to be something that pulls all the events together and is the meaning of it. All right. Let me make sure I have not missed anything that I wanted to talk about. Okay. That brings us then to the skills, which is the last bullet point on the screen. There are 2 skills that I wanted to talk about for a minute. And I'm going to get out my 3rd color of marker, so I may as well make the board look all exciting. We've mentioned a couple of times at the previous 2 class meetings that there are people who tell a story really, really badly. They'll either be long-winded, they put in parts that don't add to the story, and there's a technique that I came across years ago. And I taught a class on storytelling for a lot of years. I can no longer remember where I got this from. It was from a man who had written movie screenplays for a living. And this was his basic way of introducing student writers to how to tell a story so that it was exciting. He said, always, always, always start with action. The first thing that happens when you bring your listeners into the story, have something moving or doing something. So, your story about traveling with your family to Hawaii on a vacation, and you're in a palace, and you get separated from your parents. How could you start that story with action?
So my action. I went to Hawaii with action. What action? What would it be?
I keep thinking these things will stand up, and they won't because they're round on the end. By action, he meant someone running around, something exploding, someone throwing something. If I say, I have a marker and I'm going to write on the board, that's not action. But if I do this, that was an action. So is there anything, you being a small child, you were in this palace, what would you have been doing when you were that age?
Run around.
Yes. That, I think, is where you would begin this story.
I was running around the palace.
Exactly. How old were you?
I was 7.
So I was 7 years old, and I was running around the palace, and there were all these great things to see, and I was running up to all of them, and then I looked around, and my parents weren't there anymore. Start with that. Then B is background. A mistake a lot of people make is they'll start with all the background, and their audience just glazes over, and it's boring. So if you were to say, my family went to Hawaii on vacation, and one day we went to the palace, and while we were in the palace, and then suddenly you're running around, already some people in the room, they've got the first impression of you, and they think this is not very entertaining. The research we have on the first impressions people get of communicators, you have a few seconds to establish that you're interesting. The research, if you get interested in it, is called thin slicing. And sometimes within the first 5 to 10 seconds, people will make a judgment. I'm enjoying this, I'm not, or I'm going to tune it out. So if you start with this, start with the action, then give just enough background. Not too much, but just enough background. So you were telling that story. So I was 7 years old, which meant that I was running around, because I ran everywhere when I was 7. And I was in this palace, and there were all kinds of exciting things to see, so I'm running up to all of them, and then I turn around and my parents aren't there. Now, what background do you need to fill in now to where the audience is not confused? Because if they're too confused, you'll lose them. So there's a palace. Why is there a palace? Where's the palace at again? Is it in Japan?
In Hawaii.
And why were you in Hawaii?
I can't remember the name. I don't know the name.
Oh, it doesn't matter. But why were you in Hawaii?
Why I was in Hawaii?
Why was your family in Hawaii? Why was your family in Hawaii?
We were taking a trip.
Perfect. So, and then I turned around and my parents weren't there. We'd traveled to Hawaii for a vacation, and my parents were excited about seeing the name of the palace. My parents were excited about seeing this palace. Just enough background that they had some idea where you are and why, but not too much background. Then, do you remember earlier we talked about the parts of a story? What's the part you have to have or it's not a story?
I wasn't able to speak English.
We talked before about the parts of a story. Setting, characters, and what's the other one that you have to have or there's no story? one of the characters is being denied what they need. That's that in your story, that's what it is. But for parts of a story, any story, not just your story, there's a part you have to have, or there's no story. Right. So you're running around, you look around and your parents aren't there, you'd gone there on vacation, this is your conflict, I can't find my parents. Then, development. Development is a very simple concept. That thing that you need, that you don't have, what steps do you take to try to get it? And as you take steps to try to get what you don't have, what twists happen? What unexpected things happen that you have to overcome? What obstacles? What barriers? I couldn't find my parents. But I did find a bunch of people who looked very Japanese. And I thought, great, grown-ups, they'll help me find my parents. And then they started talking to me, and that was not Japanese. So now, that development, you thought you were going to get helped, but here's a twist, and now you have to overcome that. In the telling of the story, a really well-told story, you come up to obstacle after obstacle, you try to overcome it, but in overcoming it, here's a new obstacle. So you overcome that, here's a new obstacle. And it's all linked together, and it reveals a lot about the character. So this only goes through E. And if the last one is E, can you guess what E stands for? What would the last one be that would start with E? That's it. And the thing about an ending, there are 3 parts to an ending. The crisis, the climax, and the last line. Now, when you first told me your story, you told me that you met these Japanese-looking people, but they were speaking English, and then you stopped. The crisis is where you focus the story. There are no new developments. The story is now headed for how you're going to end it. And at that point, you hadn't reached the crisis. You were just kind of left in the middle of the story. Here are these people, they speak English, thud. But you said, so I ran away from them. And it could be there are going to be new developments. Maybe as you're running in the palace, there's a palace staffer who sees a child with no parents misbehaving, and all of a sudden you're in trouble, and that can be a new development. But you didn't do that. You went running, and you found your father. Now, how did you feel when you found your father? I bet. The climax is the part of the story with maximum emotion. So maybe you find your father and you say, I have never been so relieved in my life as when there was my father and I wasn't in this strange place all alone anymore. And then what he said is, think very hard about what's a good last line to the story, because you want the audience to go away remembering the story. So what do you think could be a good closing line to your story?
I was really... I went back to my hotel with my family.
Is there anything that you learned from the experience? Just because people look Japanese?
I learned that some people look like Japanese but don't speak English.
Sure.
Speak Japanese.
Could also be, when I'm out in public with my parents, even if things look very exciting, I need to stick with them. Sometimes you think about all the different conclusions that your listeners might take from the story, and if there's one of them where you could come up with really good language, language that's funny or language that's heartwarming, something like that where the words are so good that they're going to remember them. That's a way to end a story. Okay, so one of the skills we can talk about when it comes to defining story, that is a good way to take a story that you already know and to arrange it. If you were to tell the story of your first day here, is there some way you could start the story with action? Is there something you did that was physical that the audience could imagine? What would it be?
Okay. I was walking to the ceremony hall alone. It's action.
Walking is action. Could you make it more vivid? Did something happen that was very physical? Because your audience walks all the time. So if your listeners, they're ready to hear a story from you, and your big action is, I was walking. Yeah, we walk every day. What's the deal?
I was talking to a friend, talking to someone that I first met.
How did you first meet them? Do you remember the moment you met and what happened?
The teacher told us that to talk with the people, talk with people around me. And I looked back and I found two guys, and I started to talk.
Do you remember what you talked about?
We talked about what club we want to join.
What if you were to start with that? What if you were to say something like, so I was sitting there surrounded by people I didn't know, but I looked over my shoulder, and here were two guys, and we started to talk about what clubs, I turned around in my chair, action, and we started to talk about what clubs we wanted to join. It was my first day here at Tokyo University of Foreign Studies, and the teacher had just said, turn to people around you and have a talk. And I don't know what it was, but I just thought, these are going to be my friends. So you have action, and then you have, let's see, the short version. How did you choose this university?
I wanted to go to other university, but I didn't pass the exam, so it's the second one.
Right.
And I chose this university because the date of the exam is just later than the university I wanted to go.
So that could even be part of the background. You could say, this was not originally my first choice of university, but the dates for the exams worked out. I was admitted to this university, and now here I was. If you're telling the story of the first day, your first day at this university, was there anything going on that day that we could call a conflict? Something where you were being denied what you need. What would it be?
It's not my favorite university, but I found funny friends.
So maybe the conflict is, on that day, what you needed was a reason to feel motivated and excited about being here. And you weren't going to feel motivated and excited by it being a university you had dreamed of attending. You had another one you wanted to go to. But when you made your friends here, that helped you start to feel excited, like this might be the right place. Are there in that story any developments that you could throw in there? I wasn't sure this was where I wanted to be. I wasn't very excited. So the first thing I did to try to feel excited was this, and that created a new challenge. What would that look like?
A challenge?
Sure. The friends you made that day, were there any moments that day where you thought, oh, these guys are kind of weird?
Yeah. I found some people in the classroom that
Sure.
can talk too much.
Yes. Oh, that's good. That's good. Because now it becomes, I turned around and talked to these guys because the teacher had told me to, and I thought these are going to be my friends. This had not been my number one choice of school, but the dates for the exam worked out and I had been admitted. The problem is this was not a school I felt excited about attending, and I needed a reason to feel excited. And meeting people I thought that I could like, maybe that could be the reason. Through the day, as I talked with them, I realized some of them talked too much and talked too loud, and I thought, oh, what have I gotten myself into? And then you figure out what the ending would be. In wrapping up the story of your first day, where did you get to some satisfying emotional resolution at the end? And then, what would your last line be to sum up your whole experience of your first day at the university? If you did it that way, then you have packaged this story in a way that it's going to be easier for your listeners to keep paying attention. And you've kind of made sure that all the essential parts are there, that you didn't stop the story in the middle.
I learned that I make a few friends and very important.
The funny thing about the last line part of the story, what we keep doing, you and I, is we keep trying to, off the top of our head, think of a good last line. But writers, when they're writing stories, they'll spend days or even weeks on what the wording of the end of the story should be. Endings are very hard to write. So if you just try to, in a minute, think of the last line of a story, then you might be missing out on making it really effective. Sometimes what you have to do, I'll tell you what I do when I have a story I need to tell in a talk I'm giving, is I'll practice the story over and over again, dozens of times, sometimes 100 times or more. And at some point, boom, it'll pop into my head. But it's not the first time I tell it. It takes a while.
So what was the ending of Hawaii story? I forgot.
I was thinking that you could think hard about what did you learn from it. So it could be something along the lines of, just because people look Japanese.
Okay.
Yeah. Or it could be, I learned, no matter how exciting the place I'm in, I need to stick with my parents. Something like that. Actually, I used to do this a lot. I have a story from when I was a child, true story, that I may be able to demonstrate this whole thing, and it's got a decent last line. Okay. So, action. Ping, bonk, 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 thump. I was 4 years old and on the playground, and I had this obsession when I was 4 years old with things that were round. And I had found on the playground where they had gravel, I found a perfectly round piece of gravel. This was the best thing I'd ever seen in my life. And all around me, kids were climbing up to go down the slide. And so I let the crowd kind of push me. I got halfway up, and I dropped my piece of gravel. Bong, 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 thunk. And it fell into a hole in the slide. Well, I wanted my piece of gravel, so I stuck my finger in, and then I couldn't get it out. So, one of the kids went and found a teacher. The teacher found me with my finger stuck in the slide and pulled on it. And I said, ouch, that hurts. So the teacher went and got the principal. The principal pulled on my finger and I said, ouch, that hurts. The principal called the fire department. The fire department came, it must have been a slow day at the fire department because they came out with the siren and the lights going. They pulled on my finger. I said, ouch, that hurts. So they threw a blanket over me. They got out a chainsaw. They marked a chalk line around me and started chainsawing the slide apart. They said they were going to have to take me to the hospital with that section of the slide and surgically remove my finger. Right about then, I look up, and there's my father. And I think, great, my father is here. He has a camera. He is taking picture after picture and laughing his head off. And I yelled at him, Dad, stop laughing. Right about then, across the street from the school, there was a doctor's office. and a doctor came across the street. He saw the fire engine and thought, that's not good. But he came up to the slide as they were about to chainsaw it apart, and he said, may I have a try? And they said, go ahead. He took my hand, and he pushed in, and he broke the seal, and my finger popped right out. And later that evening, my father said, they called him at work, and they said, your son has got his finger stuck in the slide on the playground. But I have a brother. My father has 2 sons. And when they left the message, they didn't say which one. But he said, I knew it was Doyo, because if it had been my older son, he would have just ripped his finger off and run off to play. And that's the end of the story. And that's true. He really did say that. Okay, so the thing about, well, okay, that's an example of a last line, just because that was my father's joke about the whole experience.
So, the ending of my ceremony story.
Mm-hmm. Let's hear it.
Okay. Still, the 2 friends are important friends of mine.
Oh, I love it.
The last line.
Well, and you've only thought about the story maybe 2 or 3 times. That would be good to begin, and you could start rehearsing the story, and you might think of a better way to word it. So if you just keep an open mind about how to end the story.
I have to make it impressive.
Memorable. And you're making kind of a good point. Not every story is going to have a really good ending. But what I would say is it's a shame not to try for a really good last line. And if you can't think of a really good last line, okay, you can tell the story and it'll be fine. But when you can think of a good last line, that makes a story much more powerful. So it's always worth trying.
I don't come up with.
That's okay. It's time consuming. Yeah, it's usually not something that on your first try you think of it. So it's not a problem.
It's kind of joking, but one of the guys, his father is from Spain.
Wow.
So I thought that he can speak Spanish well, but
Sure.
after we were taking class together, I found that he can speak Spanish well.
Oh, I love it. I love it. Because that could be, because you found out that day that his father was from Spain, I take it? Or did you find out later on? Okay, your friend, his father was from Spain? Did you learn that day on your first day, or did you? Okay, so somewhere in here in the developments, I'm learning all these things about my new friends. One thing I learned was my friend's father is from Spain, and I thought, great, I want to major in Spanish. He'll know Spanish backward and forward, and then you go on to your next development. And then way down here for the last line, oh, and my friend whose father was from Spain, he's terrible at Spanish. That would be a good last line. Good call. All right, let's see how we're doing on time. We're doing good on time. The one last thing that I wanted to talk about skill-wise, that's good for how to tell a story. There's another researcher in the field of communication. Her name is Jenny Mandelbaum, and if you got interested, I could connect you up with her research. But she says, actually, I like the fact that we came up with rumors and gossip as a category of story, because she says most of our storytelling we don't do standing at the front of the room in front of an audience. You probably have noticed this, but when you talk with your friends, with your family, with your coworkers, you stop and tell little stories all the time. And so what she does is she says, when you have conversations with other people, you take turns. It's your turn to talk, then it's their turn to talk, and yours and theirs, and so forth. And if you're good at conversation, and if you have basic social skills, you know not to make your turn too long. You don't go on and on and on and on and not let other people talk, or other people won't like you. But when you have a story to tell in conversation, you signal to other people. She calls them actually conversational turn units, and they're not all the same length. But if you have something to say, maybe 15, 20, 30 seconds, you're going to be the one talking, and then it's someone else's turn. But there are ways you signal, okay, let me tell you what happened to me this morning, something like that, and then they know you're not going to take one turn, you're going to take the equivalent of 2 or 3. So one of the skills, she says, you have to let people know something's going to turn into a story. And you have to not do it too often. And when you're telling stories in conversation, it's really important that you watch for them to comment on the story, to point out details about the story, and you let them do it, and you welcome it. So you're telling the story about meeting your friends in a conversation, and someone says, wow, that was really lucky because, you were bummed out about the school and then you meet these really cool guys. And they throw that in. Some people with not very good conversation skills, they don't like being interrupted and they'll just talk right over it. They don't think of the people around them as someone they're talking with. They just kind of perform for an audience. So signaling you need multiple turns to the conversation. And then also being open to them participating, that's the way to be skillful in telling a story in conversation. And I think, let me see if I skipped anything there. Oh, the one other thing she did that I thought was interesting, she, from research she had done, said there is a standard set of things we use stories for in everyday conversation. And one of them we have in this list that I am erasing, because one of them is gossip. But she said, inviting, blaming, and let's see, accounting, and I'll explain what that means. That's a slightly specialized term. Telling troubles, and gossiping. Those, she said, were the major themes that in everyday conversation we turn into storytelling. So, if someone said to you, hey, my family is having a get-together this weekend. It's at a place we've gone to for years, and my grandparents are always asking me to bring some of my friends along. Would you like to come? It's going to be outdoors. We're going to have a picnic, and then we have a boat. We're going to go out on the lake. You see how that's a story? Very often when you invite people to things, and you invite them to something they haven't done before and aren't familiar with, you have to tell them a little story to paint a picture for what it is they're being invited to. Blaming, if you have a complaint against someone and you're going to make a case that a bad thing that happened is their fault, very often that involves going into a story. Here is what happened, here's what should have happened, here's what you should have known, and here's what you did, and here's how what you did created a problem for everybody. Accounting, I don't know why they use this term for it. It's just when you explain why you did what you did. So, let us say, real-world example, a week ago, I showed up thinking it was going to be another 90-minute lecture to a bunch of, or one or two, very quiet Japanese people, and you blew my mind wonderfully, because you spoke up, and we've been talking ever since. But what if I had just that moment said, why did you interrupt me? What would your explanation be?
Because I didn't understand the structure of and I wanted to understand.
Okay. That was a quick little story. Very commonly, when someone asks us, why did you do what you did? Or if we just sort of feel silently that other people want us to explain, we tell a story. I even have said a few times, I came prepared to give a lecture because all of my time here so far, if I ask students for questions or comments, the room is silent. And so I figure they seem to want lecture. Okay, I've done this for 25 years. I can lecture. Lecture it will be. That's a story. But what I prefer is to do class like this, with room for participation and questions and things like that. So that's me giving my account of why I did what I did. Telling troubles, this is probably the one that has the most in common with what I study as a professor, because one thing we turn to relationships for, friendships and family and everything else, is social support. When things are difficult and things are painful, one of the best things you can do is go find someone you feel close to, and from time spent with them, you feel better. And when you talk about, this is what's bothering me, and they give you little measures of support. They sympathize with you, they reassure you, they comfort you. That involves telling a story. And a lot of the conversational stories are about sharing your troubles. And she makes a point of saying, sometimes when someone is troubled by something painful, they'll talk too much. But you get better social support if you pay attention to the person you're talking with, and they'll chime in and say, oh, I'm so sorry. Oh, that's terrible. That's where they support you. And then finally, gossip. And gossiping, where you find people, you'll find gossip. It happens all over the world. Okay. I have been talking still quite a bit, but I want to pause here and I want to say, of everything we have talked about today, where is storytelling? What is storytelling? The parts of a story, character setting, conflict, the psychology of storytelling, the schemata, the scripts, the different kinds of knowing, and then the storytelling skills, the A, B, C, D, E, and then what happens to storytelling in conversation. Is there anything, do you have any what ifs, what abouts, anything you want to talk more about?
So, what's the ending
Yeah.
of the story?
Right.
So, we can practice to come up with.
Sure. Right.
And other than last line, crisis and climax can be also ending.
Crisis and, well, they're part of the ending. That's such a hard one to explain, the crisis and climax part. Have you ever seen Star Wars? Ah, good. That's such my best example for this. At the very beginning of Star Wars, the first thing you see is the battle between the two starships. There's the crawl of the story, and then you just see the two starships fighting each other, so there's action. In the next about 5 minutes, you learn who Luke Skywalker is, who Obi-Wan Kenobi is, who Princess Leia is. She's on the Death Star. It's all background. But Princess Leia needs Obi-Wan Kenobi's help. That's the conflict. So Obi-Wan Kenobi takes off with Luke to try to go rescue Princess Leia, and all of that is development. Now, these are the easy parts. The crisis is when they start to attack the Death Star, because there are no new developments. You know the movie is headed for the ending. They have narrowed the focus of the movie. The climax, easy. The minute the Death Star explodes, that's the climax. And then the last line, well, it's a movie, so not exactly a last line, but they have the awards ceremony, and then they start the Star Wars theme. Do, 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 and that's the big ending. Yeah. The crisis and the climax, a lot of people get confused by it. You reach the crisis of a story when you're focusing it, when it's time to wrap the story up. The climax is the part of the ending that's emotionally satisfying. If there's a bad guy, then the bad guy loses. That's the climax. I'm so glad you've seen Star Wars. I've had people say, no, I've never seen it. And I think, how do I explain this?
So if I tell stories that don't have so much conflict,
Right.
contradiction, kind of boring.
So another way, sometimes people get confused by the word conflict. Another word sometimes used for it is goal. What's the goal? There is a character in the story who wants to do something. There's something that they have not yet achieved that they want to. It's really two different ways of saying the same thing. Because if a character, if you, at this university, want to find a reason to be here, that's your goal. On the other hand, if you wanted to go to another university, you're not excited about this university, you need to find a reason to be excited, that's your conflict. That's two different ways of saying the same thing. And then the developments become, as you move toward your goal, what obstacles do you face?
So if I talk about something, it should have category, series, and schematic. It has to be in order. It should be in order.
A well-told story, it is important that you think about the events that the order are in, and that you're talking all along about how certain events cause the next event. That you're not just listing things that happened.
I think I understand.
Very cool, very cool. Today, again, was not necessarily one of the interesting or exciting days in the class. Last week we did the paradigm. Today was about some definitions we're going to use later. Next week, we are starting with a research project from a literature professor at Ohio State University, and his claim is he has found a new way to teach creativity that is much better than it's ever been taught in the past, and it has to do with stories. So, we are going to next week do some creativity exercises that have been around for decades, and then I'm going to show you his method. And that's what next week is going to be about. And it'll be cool if we have a second student here, but if not, you and I will sit and have a chat. Let me kill the recording. Boom. We will not always finish class 15 minutes early, but once in a while it's not bad.